Good afternoon. This is your South Dakota Farmers Union. We are today broadcasting direct from our camp, our All-States camp at Red Rock, Colorado, where about 14 of our outstanding young people in the Farmers Union have been gathered here to learn more about their Farmers Union, more about their democracy, and more about the world in which they live. Tonight, I have asked them to gather around the microphone here this last evening in which we have shared so much, to tell you just a little bit about their reactions to camp. I want all of you in our South Dakota radio audience to know that we're particularly proud that one of our campers, Daryl Ray Christian, was elected to the council of the All-States camp. We take a great deal of pride in this because this means that the 200 young people here felt that Daryl Ray had leadership qualities which were unique and that he was an able young citizen, and have therefore given him the trust of helping with the camp next year in its governing board and its advisory council. To my immediate right is Arlene Schley. Arlene has been active in Farmers Union, and while she was here, she has taken a big part in many of the activities, and her popularity itself when she was elected to the governing board here at All States Camp. Arlene, would you say a few words to people back in our state?
Well, I would like to say this has been one of the most wonderful experiences of my life. Being on the governing board has given me a little bit of, well, chance to talk to more of the kids and get their opinion of what's going on, and I've really enjoyed it. I think that this is a swell bunch of juniors, and I hope that all states camps to come will be at least this good, if not better.
Thank you, Arlene. Arlene was one of our major students taking part in a panel on civil liberties, and we here at All States know that we have in her leadership qualities. Now, just coming into the room is Daryl Ray Christian. Daryl Ray has made us happy in many ways, particularly with his accordion and his wonderful musical mind and feet. Now, across the mic from me is Amy Ritterbush. Amy, would you tell people what you have enjoyed most about this experience in camp?
Well, I feel as if that I'm going home richly invigorated with this co-op spirit, and I really enjoyed meeting all these wonderful young people.
Were you on the co-op board, Amy?
No, I wasn't.
Glenn, would you care to give greetings back home and tell them a little bit about what you learned in Reverend Earnshaw's class on civil liberties?
Well, I think it was a great camp, and I've really enjoyed myself meeting all the kids from different states, and I've learned quite a bit in Reverend Earnshaw's class about civil liberties. And I want to express my thanks for being here, and I'd sure like to meet all the rest of them that could come other times.
Richard Hayter is here, and Richard, you participated in Hanton, I believe the name is. I should pronounce it right. I met your mother at the wonderful camp in the Black Hills not too long ago. Richard, I wondered if you would tell the people about our aspect of emphasis on the international one-worldness, that we're all one human family, and in the Farmers Union, and in our nation, and in our world.
Well, I think that all the people in the United States and all across the world should be able to be together and talk over all problems in the world. And I had a wonderful time here at All States Camp with all the kids.
Did you enjoy the speakers such as Constance Fisher, who just came back from India, and this interesting man from Iran whom we had today?
Yes, I thought that was a very interesting speech that them two persons had given.
And we don't want to forget the speaker that we had in Miss Ann Lothman, who told us about her days behind the Iron Curtain. I felt all of us responded to that with what I would say understanding, and certainly felt that our way in America of democracy is far superior to anything else that has been proven in the way of government. Preston Jensen, I thought for a while that you were going to elude us and not come in on this roundtable interview with South Dakota campers. Preston, your big contribution that I have noticed has been around that kitchen. You have been head of a KP team. I was quite impressed with this honor being cast upon you because you know a part of camp that everyone loves is the kitchen. Would you tell a little bit about the cooperation that went on there? Was everybody one happy family, or were the victuals flying around?
Well, everybody was pretty much one happy family. They all showed up for work and did their job like they were supposed to, and they didn't have to rely on too much on me.
Yvonne Bradwish, would you like to say a few words here in the mic to your folks and your local and your district about what you have gained here at All States Camp?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you, too. And I've really been having a fine time. And I think we've all learned much from these interesting speakers in our classes, such as Reverend Earnshaw's.
And here we have a sister of Yvonne, Lillian Bradwish, Vivian, for quite some time here in camp. None of us knew that they were sisters, but the truth will out. So Vivian, I want you to express your greetings home too.
First of all, I'd like to thank the South Dakota Farmers Union for extending this scholarship to me to come to this wonderful all-states camp. I don't think I'll ever have another experience that will be so wonderful. This has been a very big highlight to my life in Farmers Union, and I hope to carry it on for the rest of my life.
One more member of our campers is here, Richard Bong. Richard, I don't believe you've said a word to those people back home who made this camp possible. Won't you come up close to the mic and say a few words?
Well, there isn't much else to say. Everybody else has covered the subjects pretty thoroughly, but I thought the highlight of the camp was this morning when Mrs. Edwards discussed quite seriously our part in our coming generation. And I hadn't really realized how much responsibility there was, and I believe most of the campers also realized at the time. And we were most generally in a pretty happy-go-lucky mood, but it set us to pretty much serious thinking. And I believe that it's going to set us more straight and help for a better generation to come in our governmental activities and other things of that nature.
Well, that was certainly a very fine and a very true statement. One of the things we seem to have forgotten here, I suppose it's because we've been in it most of the time, is the wonderful recreation, the kind of recreation that Farmers Union groups always have in singing, in dancing, and in doing things together. Arlene, you seem to be out there dancing on that blacktop every night. I wondered if you would tell our friends back home how the square dancing is really done when young people 18 to 22 get hold of it.
Oh, it's really swell. You just can't imagine until you actually participate in it. We have many group dances and couple dances in which we keep switching partners all the time, and this is very good in the cooperative spirit because everyone gets into the act. And when we get started square dancing, it really is wonderful. It just goes through you.
Well, that was very fine. Another thing we've been doing here at camp, I know they're all exhausted tonight, but one of the other things we've been doing are handicrafts. We've been learning a lot about art and handicraft. We've also had sociodrama. We've also had talent night, in which many of these young people have shown their abilities. We have also had an extensive course on the meaning of the Farmers Union, its organizational structure, its plans for the future. And believe you me, when you've attended this camp, you know that the voice of the future is the Farmers Union. And these young people are going to take their role as leaders in this great organization of America. Thank you.
Like the New York Times or the Christian Science Monitor or one of those very reliable papers which present both points of view. This morning I'm going to talk about the First Amendment in its relationship to the communist conspiracy. The aim of the communist conspiracy, of course, is the destruction of democracy. They attempt to do this by infiltrating our unions, our schools, our government agencies, and creating dissension, and thereby weakening our land. Now, somebody asked the question yesterday about the number of communists we have here in America. I've been disturbed about the lack of knowledge on the part of many of our citizens on these particular facts. In 1951, according to figures put out by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, there were 25,000. Now, how many do we have in our country? 160-some million. And most of these 25,000 were found in and around metropolitan New York. That was in 1950. Now, even their bragging membership was only 60,000. In 1955, according to Herbert Brownell, from the files released by the FBI, there was a decrease of 3,000. There were only 22,000 communists, admitted communists. And this is from the FBI, and certainly they're the ones that know. In the period from 1930 to 1939, as many as 1 million Americans affiliated themselves with the Communist Party, mainly because the Communist Party at that time, well, at least the people had the understanding that communism was anti-fascist. And you remember that was the time when Hitler and Mussolini was in power, and they were coming to their own. And many of our people were against, well, in fact, all of our people were against this type of totalitarianism, this fascism, and they looked for something which was anti-fascist. And apparently they felt that communism met this particular bill. But when they found out that the communist movement was a bedfellow of fascism, they resigned and they got out. Bad judgment, not disloyalty, is the worst that can be charged to the vast majority of these ex-communists. Professor Jack Pelton, a political science teacher at the University of Illinois, says, and let me quote him, "It is cause for comfort rather than alarm to recognize that under the conditions most favorable to them," meaning the Depression days of the 30s, "the communists could convince so few Americans." Don't misunderstand me now, please. I'm not minimizing communism. We all should understand, I think we all have the idea that if communism gains control of America, our civil liberties would go out the window. No civil liberties in Russia today. But the problem is, you see, how? This is a question of means. How do we control the communists? Many of our demagogues, and you know what I mean by a demagogue, don't you? A definition of a demagogue is Joseph McCarthy. Many of our demagogues haven't been able to clearly distinguish between those who are conspirators and those, the unorthodox. Also, it's one thing to punish men for attempts to overthrow the government by force. But what about this area of speech, this idea of advocating the overthrow of the government by force? In attempting to control the fascists, and that's what the communists are, I think that was the consensus yesterday in our panel, in attempting to control the fascists, should we mimic or should we ape them? Should we use the same methods that they're using? Doesn't freedom of speech form the basis for an open society, for a free society? It seems to me that you can't operate a democracy as long as the citizens are criticized or punished for criticizing the ruling group. If everybody agrees to talk and convince others to their point of view by persuasion, we're on safe grounds. But now, what about those who advocate a change by violence? Should we allow them to engage in political discussions? Well, this is the question. This is what we talked about yesterday. And I want to go back and look a little bit into the history, into the background. For as I said, I think that the majority of Americans are suffering from amnesia. They have lost their memories, or else they never knew the backgrounds of history. And certainly history has this value that it gives us a perspective, and it keeps us from making the same mistakes that were made before. So let's go back and take the period from the First World War up until today. Now, of course, again, I'm going to take just a few moments, and it's just going to be a sketchy outline. I'm just going to take some of the salient points. But I think that it will show us that some of the mistakes that we've made in the past can be prevented if we know about them and if we know some of the underlying ideas that came about from these things. You remember the First World War, we were fighting the Germans. And we had over in Russia the Tsar. And then back in, well, right after the First World War, the Russian Revolution occurred. And this added to all the problems we had along with the war. To combat the hysteria, and after all, there were many, many people in those days that were frightened to death about the Bolsheviks. Congress of the United States passed the Espionage Act of 1917. And then in 1918, they passed the Sedition Act. Remember, we defined sedition yesterday. And while these two laws were on our statutes, over 2,000 people were convicted for speaking or publishing against the war effort. Some were arrested for advocating that the government support the war through taxation instead of the war bonds, as we were supporting the war. Some people were convicted and sentenced to prison because they said that war was not right. Aftermath of the war. Because of this hysteria, war policies and the peace aims were just not discussed. And this is the sad part, Americans were not ready when the war ended to offer any real solutions. They were not ready to put forth any proposals. And when the great forward-looking thinker Woodrow Wilson submitted his 14 points at Versailles, and included in that was the League of Nations, the majority of Americans had not thought this through. This was something new and radical, and they were not willing to go along with it. You know how new ideas have trouble in the beginning. And so, after this, the League of Nations, because of other reasons too, but the League of Nations was rejected here in the United States, and we continued a policy of isolation. Well, the Russian Revolution terrorized Americans. There was a great deal of intolerance for anything that had to do with Bolshevik ideas. Why, peaceful aliens were seized without even warrants. We pushed aside due process of law. And in 1920, in the New York Assembly, they refused to seat 5 duly elected socialists. Now, not communists, but socialists. Between the era of 1917 and 1920, there was no balancing of open discussion, and the risks of insecurity caused this pendulum that we have to go up toward the right. That is, to the point where there was no freedom. The First Amendment had no power because the fear of Bolshevik mobs was the only idea that the people had. We have seen that the threat was much exaggerated. In fact, as we look back, we see that the Russian people as such had no idea. Well, in fact, they had so many problems in their own backyard that they couldn't have done anything. But at the time, it was over-exaggerated, and people were worried. They thought that every time they looked under the sofa, they'd find a communist there. Well, let's take a look at the courts. I'm telling you this because many people today think that this is the first time that America has ever gone through a time of crisis. And actually, we went through a time of crisis perhaps even more so than we have right after the World War II. But let's look at the courts. Now, the Supreme Court of our land is the instrument. You know how we're set up. We're set up with the 3 main divisions of our government. We have the legislative, and they pass the laws. We have the executive, that's the president and his staff. They carry out the laws. And then we have the third check and the balance. We have the judicial department. And they're the courts. And the courts balance these other two by deciding whether, say, what the legislative end of the government, what the bills that they pass, whether they're consistent with the Constitution. And we found out that in many times the courts have thrown many things out. Take, for instance, the NRA. Remember that was declared unconstitutional? So the court has a great power, and it has exercised this power in many ways in our United States. Well, so let's look at the courts, because they determine a lot about our thinking. When we review some of these historic cases, 2 names stand out, and I think you ought to remember and ought to know about these 2 names. One of them was he was later Chief Justice. One was Louis Brandeis, Brandeis, and the other was Oliver Wendell Holmes. Now, these two men played a great part in the development of the American concept of free speech, and that's what we're talking about this morning. Their eloquent opinions, mostly I should say in dissent. You know what I mean by dissent? When a court makes a decision, there are 9 on the Supreme Court, and say that 8 of them decide that this is the way it should be. And perhaps the one person says, no, I disagree with the other 8 justices. And he is permitted to write up an opinion. And if it's not what the majority says, it is what is called a dissent. And many times later, and many years later, in fact, they'll go back to the dissenting opinion and say, well, the facts of history have proven that this man had more insight than the other 8 or the other 5 or whatever it may be. And so Justice Brandeis and Holmes were great jurists, and they dissented, you'll find, in most cases. Well, I want to take 3 cases. In many cases you could take for observation, but I want you just to think about 3 particular cases. The first was a case that came up for trial, for review rather, by the Supreme Court in 1919. Now, all of these cases are given the name of the person who was brought up before the Supreme Court, or a corporation, or whoever it might be, versus the United States. This one was called Schenck versus the United States. Now, I'm following our 3rd lecture outline, and I have all these cases and their dates listed for your convenience. Schenck was a late leader in the Socialist Party, back after the First World War. Now, you remember from my background how much hysteria we had in those days. He was not a communist, he was a socialist. And I think you can say that the difference between the Socialist Party and the Communist Party is that the one main difference was the Socialist Party believed in change through evolution, peaceful means, whereas the Communists believed in revolution and violent means of overthrow. Well, Schenck was the leader in the Socialist Party, and he was convicted of urging men to resist the draft, and he was prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Now, Schenck thought that the First Amendment allowed him to urge men, if he felt called, according to his conscience, to urge men to resist the draft. And he said the First Amendment protected him. And the courts reversed, said that he was guilty. And of course, in America, we always have the right, if we feel that there's an injustice done, to appeal. And that's what he did. And he appealed his case up to a high federal court, and he was turned down there. And there he took his court up to the highest court, took his case up to the highest court of our land, the Supreme Court. Now, this particular instance, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the main opinion, the affirmative opinion, and it was a unanimous court decision. It reversed the opinion that Schenck was guilty, and Justice Holmes wrote an opinion. And they said that he had protection under the First Amendment. And let me quote to you a passage from Oliver Wendell Holmes. He says, "We admit that in many places and in ordinary times, the defendant, in saying all that was said, would have been within their constitutional rights. But the character of every act depends upon the circumstances in which it is done. The question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are used of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. It is a question of proximity and degree." And the important part of that paragraph that I just read to you are the words, "a clear and present danger." This is a new doctrine that was born, a clear and present danger doctrine. And it gave the First Amendment a new meaning. Now, this was not written into the First Amendment, but from this time on, many court decisions that were brought up before the Supreme Court were acted upon by this criteria, whether it presented a clear and a present danger. And after all, the Constitution is what the judges say that it is. Is that not right? Holmes' doctrine then implied that the circumstances in which words are used makes a difference. You can go out in the field and you can shout fire all you want and no one will bother you. But you go into a crowded theater and shout fire and somebody is going to arrest you. So it depends on the circumstances, whether or not what you say creates a clear and present danger. Now there's a second court decision that I think has relevance for us. This was in 1919. That's when it came before the Supreme Court. On August 18th of 1918, there were 6 young men and a girl. These happened to be Russian immigrants. They were arrested and convicted under the sedition law for dropping leaflets from a building, top of a building in New York City. They denounced President Wilson for sending troops to Russia, and they urged workers to refuse to produce munitions. Now, all of these people were brought to court, and they all suffered a sentence of from 15 to 20 years, just merely dropping leaflets. Now they appealed this, of course they were convicted, and they appealed their decision to the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court in this instance said that they were guilty and said that the other courts were right. And they said there was a dangerous tendency in this. Now, here's another doctrine that the Supreme Court enunciated. Because they said what these things said that what they had written in the leaflets presented a dangerous tendency. Now, in this case, Justice Brandeis in Holmes dissented. And I'm going to read you a portion of the dissent that Justice Holmes wrote. I'm quoting now. But when men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may come to believe even more that they believe the very foundations of their own conduct, that the ultimate good desired is better reached by a free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. The same thing that was brought out by one of our gals from Utah. You remember that yesterday. She almost quoted Justice Holmes here. And I go on, I'm quoting, and that truth is the only ground upon which their wishes safely can be carried out. That at any rate is the theory of our Constitution. And then Justice Holmes says, I think we should be eternally vigilant against attempts to check the expression of opinions that we loathe and believe to be fraught with death, unless they so imminently threaten immediate interference with the lawful and pressing purposes of the law that an immediate check is required to save the country. Here he is saying that we must have a clear and present danger again. And of course he is saying that truth is able best to win out if it's left in the free and open marketplace. Now the third court decision that I want you to pay attention to was in 1925 in a case called Gitlow versus New York. Now Benjamin Gitlow was a left-wing socialist. He was convicted under the New York Anarchy Law of 1902 for publishing a communistic pamphlet which advocated the violent overthrow of our nation by the class struggle method. And this went up to the Supreme Court, as I said, in 1925. And one of the things about this case was this, that for the first time, the Supreme Court interfered using the 14th Amendment as its authority and said that the states could not restrict free speech or could not keep people from, could not regiment their thinking. They said that the First Amendment protected citizens. And they used, as I say, the 14th Amendment. Never before, in the year 1925, never before that, had the Supreme Court ever stepped in and dictated to the states on this area of free speech. Well, in the 30s and in the 40s, you remember when President FDR took over, he appointed many liberal and younger judges. And we had some very, very wonderful decisions in terms of civil rights. Wonderful from my point of view. Most cases were brought before them that infringed upon the First Amendment were reversed, and people were allowed to say what they believed. I want to say three things that we can learn from history. First of all, in times of external danger to our national security, free speech comes under fire most. That's obvious, isn't it? When there's an enemy lurking around the corner, well, we're apt to suppress free speech. The second lesson that we get from history is this, that the community, and not the judges, determines the extent of how much free speech is to be limited. And the third lesson that we learn from history is that in past times, in times of tension, the threats to our national security tend to be exaggerated, and dissenters have been confused oftentimes with traitors. Those who disagree with the orthodox opinion sometimes have been labeled as traitors when actually they were just dissenters. This is, I'm afraid, what's happened today in many cases. Well, let's look at the picture today. I want to look at the Taft-Hartley bill, the Taft-Hartley law. All of you probably are familiar with this law. A section of the law reads as follows. Well, let me just say something before I read this section. Before a union could have the advantages of the NRLB, the National Labor Relations Board, it must file affidavits from each of its officers, and each of the officers must declare, and I'm going to read, that he is not a member of the Communist Party or affiliated with such a party, and that he does not believe in and is not a member of or supports any organization that believes in or teaches the overthrow of the United States government by force or by any illegal or unconstitutional method. End quote. That's from the Taft-Hartley bill. Well, the union leaders, when this came out, were absolutely furious. They protested vigorously, and they denounced this as an un-American and unconstitutional. And the courts had a chance to review this. And in 1950, it came up to the Supreme Court in what is called the Dowds case, D-O-U-D-S. Now, the Supreme Court, much to everybody's surprise, upheld the Taft-Hartley bill. They upheld the conviction on this particular man, Dowds, who refused to sign this loyalty oath. That's what it is. And they dodged the constitutionality of this. And Chief Justice Vinson, at that time, wrote the opinion, and he said that the loyalty oath was all right. He didn't even talk about the constitutionality of it. He said that it was because that Congress had thought of the loyalty oath as regulating interstate commerce, and it did not jeopardize free speech. In other words, the clear and present danger wasn't even used here. And of course there were dissents there, and I won't read some of those. Then in 1940, I'm going back a little bit because this forms the background of some of the things I want you to discuss. Congress passed a Peacetime Sedition Act. Remember, you remember yesterday we defined sedition, and I have it down in your outlines. An act which goes under the title the Smith Act. This was the first sedition act ever passed in the United States, since 1789, and this was under the threat, the external threat of the Germans, the Nazis. And Section 2 of the Smith Act makes it unlawful to advocate or teach the doctrine of violent overthrow of a United States government. This is the one that we're going to be concerned with, because this is a major departure in policy. In 1949, 11 men were convicted as communists. They were tried, given a fair hearing, and they were convicted under the Smith Act. Now, the attorneys that defended these 11 communists based their defense on the fact that there was no clear and present danger. They went right back to Oliver Wendell Holmes, his enunciation there of the clear and present danger, and they said, yes, we admit that our clients wrote these things and they taught certain things. But there's nothing dangerous about it. There's nothing that's going to overthrow the government. There was nothing overtly done. You see, it was an advocating. Well, this plea was pushed aside, this was ignored, and they were convicted. And in 1951, it was brought before the Supreme Court in the now famous Dennis case. And the Supreme Court upheld the lower court. They said they were perfectly in order. This act was constitutional. And Chief Justice Vinson said that the danger, if the danger is substantial, it need not be imminent. That is, if it's What he's saying there is that communism is a dangerous conspiracy that's highly organized, and even though there's no immediate danger, there's still a terrible danger to our country. And the court decision implied that Congress, who actually represent the people, can determine the danger in seditious speech, and they ruled the Smith Act as constitutional. Now, Justice Black and Justice Douglas, whom we read, whose article, Douglas's article, we have in our pamphlet, dissented. And I want to follow the arguments that Black and Douglas gave, because I think that this gives you the other side. Black attacked the argument that it was up to Congress. He attacked the argument that Congress felt that they could determine what kinds of speech that they wanted to have restricted. He said, I'm quoting, such a doctrine waters down the First Amendment so that it amounts to a little more than an admonition to Congress. He says, when you start saying that you can tell what is dangerous and what isn't dangerous, you might as well throw the Constitution out. Now listen to Douglas's reasoning. And I don't have to tell you, I'm pretty prejudiced at this point, that he is, what I feel, one of the greatest men in our history. He said that the trial was an error because the only evidence which the 11 communists were accused of was organizing to teach others and themselves the Marxist-Leninist doctrine contained in 4 books. He says, and these books, you see, haven't been outlawed. Then he says, why does using them in a classroom become a crime? Now here is some more of Douglas's reasoning, and let me quote them for you. This record contains no evidence, meaning the record of the Dennis case. As he read it through, he says it contains no evidence whatsoever showing that the acts charged the teaching of the Soviet theory of revolution with the hope that it will someday be realized have created any clear and present danger to the nation. He went back to Oliver Wendell Holmes's doctrine, and he said he didn't think that it was any clear and present danger. They didn't use this doctrine. He said the ruling is, in my view, not responsive to the issue in the case. We might as well say that the speech of petitioners is outlawed because Soviet Russia and a Red Army are a threat to world peace. Then he says, they are miserable merchants of unwanted ideas. Their wares remain unsold. The fact that their ideas are abhorrent does not make them powerful. The invisible army of petitioners is the best known, the most beset, and the least thriving of any fifth column in history. Only those held by fear and panic could think otherwise. These were the words of Justice William Douglas in dissent. He went on to say that Congress should not call a halt to free speech, except in a case of extreme peril from the speech itself. And he said that the First Amendment warns us against this. There's one more point that I want to bring up, and that's about the McCarran Act. Some of you have heard about the McCarran Act. This was the Internal Security Act of 1950. This was passed during the emotional uprising of the Korean situation. And there were a number of provisions in the McCarran Act. There are 3 important points for our discussion. I've listed those, again, in your little brochure. First of all, that all communist organizations had to register. Secondly, it made it a crime to work for the communist cause in the United States. And it thirdly restricted communist-tainted aliens from entering the United States. In the first point, the fact that all communist organizations should register, under this they provided for a 5-man subversive control activity board. And the Attorney General turned over to this board all the names of organizations, and then this board passed on whether the organizations were communist or communist front organizations. And then if the board decided that the Farmers Union was a communist front organization, then, or whatever organization it was, the organization in question must submit names and addresses of members in the organization and where they got funds to operate. On September 22nd, President Harry Truman vetoed this bill. And I want to quote to you some of the reasoning he used when he vetoed it. He said that many of its provisions were unconstitutional, and he said this was a very unwise bill. He warned that the Communist Front provision would be dangerous to the nation. He said that many organizations whose policies coincided, just incidentally coincided with the particular communist line of the moment, would be falsely accused. He used such reasoning as this, and this is not his example, this is mine. For instance, the communists believe in brotherhood. Jesus Christ believes in brotherhood, therefore Jesus is a communist. I mean, that's the type of reasoning that he felt was so dangerous in this McCarran bill. And this brings it up, in the light of all that we've discussed and examined, the question of whether Congress can, whether it has the authority to outlaw a political party. Can they outlaw belief? Or does not the First Amendment protect such? President Truman said the act was unnecessary because he said the FBI already knew all about the communists. He said they had them spotted. They knew exactly what they were doing. They traced them in every moment. I needn't tell you that our good senator, our senator from South Dakota, Carl Munt, defended this act. He said that this would bring the Reds into the open, and he said that the Americans must know about what the communists are doing. As we look back on it, we see that this provision of the act hasn't worked. It hasn't accomplished its purpose. And then in August of 1954, the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, headed by the brother of one of our members seated here, Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, led a group, and they passed the Communist Control Act, probably in a political move to counteract the idea that the Democrats had gone soft on communism. And this act actually outlaws the party. It's a crime today if you belong to the communists. It's a crime to become a communist. Now this is all I'm going to say this morning. I want you, if you will, when you break up into your discussion groups, to look at the three positions. I have it printed up. They're in the yellow sheets. I wish you, as a group, go over those things. I want you again to come back with a question or two, or how many you have. I wish your chairman would give me that question or questions sometime this afternoon. And then I'm going to pick another panel. And tomorrow I'm going to let you discuss these things that I brought up. Now, without further delay, would you please go to your
That's
group.
on page 6, the yellow page.
On page 6, the yellow page of your little outline.
You decided against it, baby. You decided against